Katrina J. O'Connor, once a brilliant forensic accountant for the city's elite, becomes a hunted woman after discovering a billion-dollar embezzlement scheme orchestrated by her firm's senior partner, Thomas K. Mosley. After witnessing Mosley's cleaners dispose of her mentor, Katrina fakes her own death in a spectacular bridge accident and assumes a vow of silence to become a non-entity. She finds refuge as a mute archival clerk at O'Donnell Holdings, the impenetrable fortress of the notoriously ruthless James H. O'Donnell. For 6 months, her silence is her shield, protecting her from the deadly secret she carries. But when security audit forces her into O'Donnell's direct line of sight, she realizes she has traded one predator's cage for another, and this new CEO is far more observant than she ever feared. Before we deep into the story, please let me know in the comment where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you, and I don't want you to miss it anything. Now, let's get into the story. The world believed that a woman's intelligence was her greatest asset. For Katrina, it was a target. It was the brilliance that had uncovered the monster. She sat on the edge of the hard plastic chair in the subway terminal, her hands folded so tightly her knuckles were white. The air was stale. The tiles were gray. The very scent of the underground tasted of exhaust and cold metallic fear. She had not spoken a word in 6 months. And in those 6 months, for the first time in her life, she was safe. The silence was a shield, an armor she had forged in the fire that last terrible night in the Mosley boardroom just half a year ago. She had been Katrina J. O'Connor, the protege of the firm, educated in forensic logic and high-level finance. She had lived in a glass high-rise, her father's pride. But her father was gone, his reputation destroyed by the same men now hunting her. The evidence that would have saved her was encrypted in a dead man's drive, and the world had been thrown open to the wolves. Thomas K. Mosley had inherited the firm's power. He had inherited the clients, the influence, and the secrets. And he looked at Katrina as just one more liability to be liquidated. The memory was a physical, choking thing. It came at night, the mahogany-lined office where Thomas now sat, his feet on the desk once belonging to her father. He had been drinking. His associate was downstairs, cleaning the mess left in the archives. "It's your mind," Thomas had hissed at her that morning. So sharp, so analytical. You see numbers where others see noise. You think you're better than the system. Thomas's greed had been a torment. His cruelty was a terror. That night in the office, he'd smiled. The smile of a predator who knows the trap is sprung. "My little accountant," he'd slurred, "living on my payroll. Such a pretty, clever little bird. And you've never once balanced the books for me." She had backed away, her hands finding the cold glass of the office window. "You're insane, Thomas. The SEC will find the trail." Her voice, that was her mistake. Her voice, clear, professional, and uncompromising. The sound of it lit a fire in Thomas's eyes. "Ah," he whispered, advancing. "There it is, the voice of the whistleblower. You think you can talk your way to justice? Stop speaking." He'd grab her wrist, his grip like iron. "You know what I want. You are the daughter of a disgraced man. You are nothing." She had done the only thing she could. She had run. She had run past the silent security guards, out into the freezing city rain. She had staged a crash, sold her mother's jewelry for a fake ID, and found her way to the shadows. The clerk at the temp agency had asked her name. "Katrina," she'd whispered, her last word. She had just stared after that, her throat closing, the terror of the boardroom swallowing her. The clerk sighed, another broken soul. She was given a gray lanyard, a desk in the sub-basement, and she was left alone. Without her voice, her beauty faded into the background. She was just a quiet woman in a gray cardigan. Men in the elevators didn't look at her. Her silence made her invisible. It was the only power she had ever known. She would never speak again. The boardroom was a cathedral of glass and cold blue light, perched high above the city like a vulture's nest. Outside, The skyline was a glittering promise, but inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive bourbon and the metallic tang of an impending execution. Katrina stood at the foot of the long mahogany table, her fingers trembling as they clutched the physical ledger she had pulled from the fire. She was a firm star forensic accountant, the woman who could hear the heartbeat of a corporation through its numbers, and today, that heartbeat had gone flat. Thomas K. Mosley sat at the head of the table, the chair that had belonged to Katrina's father until 6 months ago. He didn't look like a murderer. He looked like a god of industry in a $3,000 suit. But as he leaned forward, the light caught the jagged edge of his smile, and Katrina saw the predator beneath the polish. He had been drinking, the amber liquid in his glass swirling with a lazy, hypnotic rhythm. "You have a gift, Katrina," Thomas said, his voice a low, sandpaper rasp that set her nerves on edge. "You see the patterns the rest of us miss. You find the ghosts in the machine. But you've made a very dangerous mistake. You've given those ghosts a voice." He gestured to the ledger in her hand. "The billion-dollar discrepancy. The offshore shell companies. You spent the last 48 hours building a case that would end my life. And you did it with that sharp, uncompromising tongue of yours. You've been talking to the auditors, haven't you? Whispering in the ears of the men who want to tear this firm down." "I am doing my job, Thomas," Katrina said, her voice clear and resonant, echoing off the glass walls. "My father built this firm on integrity. You've turned it into a laundering mat for the city's worst. I'm not whispering. I'm speaking the truth." The sound of her own voice, steady and authoritative, felt like a shield in that moment. But as Thomas rose from his chair, the shield felt suddenly thin. He walked toward her, his silhouette blocking out the city lights, until he was close enough that she could see the cold, unblinking malice in his eyes. He reached out, not to strike her, but to grip her chin, forcing her to meet his stare. "That's the problem," he whispered, his breath hot against her skin. "Your voice. It's too loud. It's too convincing. You think you're the heroine of this story, but you're just a girl who knows too much and talks too much. Phoebe was right. Your intellect is a weapon, and I cannot have weapons pointed at me in my own house." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a lethal hiss. "Your father is dead because he didn't know when to be quiet. Don't make the same mistake. Every word you say from this moment on is a death warrant. You want to save this firm? You want to stay alive? Then stop speaking. Become the nobody you were meant to be before your father gave you a seat at this table." He shoved her back, her heels skidding on the polished floor. In that moment, Katrina looked at the ledger, then at the man who had just admitted to destroying her world. She realized with a sickening jolt that her brilliance was no longer an asset. It was a neon sign for her own assassination. Her voice, the very thing she used to command respect, was now the trail the monster would follow to find her. As she turned to flee the room, the silence of the hallway felt like a tomb, and she realized that if she wanted to survive the night, she would have to bury Katrina J. O'Connor forever. The rain didn't just fall. It hammered against the windshield of the sedan like 1,000 tiny hammers trying to shatter the glass. Katrina gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles ghost white in the rhythmic sweep of the wipers. She was driving toward the Blackwood Bridge, the high-arched spine of concrete that spanned the churning, icy currents of the river below. In the passenger seat sat her former life, a designer handbag, her encrypted laptop, and the ivory-handled umbrella her father had given her on her graduation day. Every item was a breadcrumb that Thomas K., Mosley's cleaners, would follow. To disappear, she didn't just need to run. She had to die. The bridge loomed out of the fog, a skeletal shadow against the black sky. Katrina slowed the car as she reached the midpoint of the span, the highest point above the water. Her heart was a frantic drum in her chest, but her mind, the cold, forensic machine that Thomas so feared, was perfectly still. She shifted the car into neutral, her hand trembling only slightly as she reached for the door handle. She took one last look at the woman in the rear-view mirror. Katrina J. O'Connor, the brilliant accountant, the woman who spoke truth to power, With a sharp, decisive movement, she kicked the accelerator pedal with her hand while standing outside the car, then shoved the gear into drive through the open window. The sedan lurched forward, tires screaming against the wet asphalt. It hit the guardrail with a sickening, metallic crunch, the metal yielding just enough to launch the vehicle into the abyss. There was a heartbeat of absolute silence, then a distant, muffled splash as the river swallowed the car, the secrets, and the woman the world knew. Katrina didn't stay to watch the ripples. She was already moving, hooded and head down, toward the maintenance stairs at the edge of the bridge. By the time the first police sirens began to wail in the distance, she was a mile away in a fluorescent-lit bus station, smelling of grease and exhaust. She retreated into a corner stall of the women's restroom, the tiles a sickly, institutional yellow. She pulled a pair of kitchen shears from her bag and began to hack. The long chestnut hair, the aristocratic mane that Thomas had sneered at, fell into the sink in heavy, wet clumps. She scrubbed her face with industrial soap until the glow of luxury was replaced by a raw, hollowed-out pallor. She emerged from the stall wearing a shapeless, thrift store cardigan and thick-rimmed glasses that distorted her sharp features. She sat on the hard plastic chair of the waiting area, surrounded by the city's invisible people. When the ticket clerk asked for her destination, she didn't speak. She simply pointed to a map of the city's industrial district and slid a crumpled $20 bill across the counter. The clerk didn't even look up, scribbling a nameless receipt and sliding it back. The silence was cold and heavy, a physical weight settling into her throat. She felt the urge to cry out, to scream at the unfairness of the void, but she choked the impulse back. To speak was to leave a trail. To be silent was to be safe. As the bus pulled out into the night, Katrina watched the bridge disappear in the distance. The girl who knew the secrets of the ledger was gone. In her place sat a nameless clerk, a ghost in a gray sweater, entering the world of the living as a shadow that no one would ever bother to notice. The glass and steel monolith of O'Donnell Holdings stood like a silent sentinel over the financial district, its obsidian surface reflecting the city with a cold, impenetrable indifference. While the Mosley building felt like a vulture's nest, this place was a fortress, designed not just to house wealth, but to guard it with a clinical, military precision. Katrina stood at the service entrance, her frame swallowed by a shapeless charcoal blazer, a lanyard with generic, temporary staff, badge hanging heavy around her neck. She was no longer a woman with a name. She was Archive Clerk 402. As she was led deep into the bowels of the building, past the biometric scanners and the hushed, high-tech corridors of the executive floors, the light began to dim. The archives were located in the sub-basement, a sprawling labyrinth of climate-controlled rooms where the paper trail of the O'Donnell Empire went to be forgotten. It was a world of hushed whispers and the scent of old parchment and cooling servers. For Katrina, it was paradise. Here, amidst the floor-to-ceiling shelves of sorted data, she could finally disappear. Her supervisor, a man whose skin was as gray as the filing cabinets he managed, handed her a handheld scanner. He spoke in low, clipped sentences, barely looking at her. The system is automated, but the physical backups must be cross-referenced manually. It's tedious. Most people quit within a week because of the isolation. He paused, finally looking at her through thick lenses. You're the one who doesn't talk, right? Katrina offered a small, hesitant nod, keeping her chin tucked. She didn't let the brilliance in her eyes spark. She kept them dull, focused only on the task at hand. The supervisor grunted, seemingly satisfied. Good. Mr. O'Donnell values efficiency and silence. Stick to the manifest, and you'll find no one bothers you here. Left alone in the quiet hum of the archives, Katrina felt the tension in her shoulders ease for the first time in months. She began to move through the rows, her hands finding a rhythm in the filing and sorting. She was a ghost in the machine, a flicker of movement in the peripheral vision of the security cameras. To the rest of the building, she was part of the infrastructure, as unremarkable as the plumbing or the electrical wiring. However, as she handled the physical ledgers of O'Donnell Holdings, her old instincts, the one she had tried to bury in the river, began to twitch. Her eyes reflexively scanned the margins of the balance sheets she was filing. Even in the dark, her mind began to piece together the architecture of the O'Donnell fortune. It was clean, terrifyingly so, but there were shadows in the corners, discrepancies that only someone with her specific, deadly education would notice. She stood in the center of the silent room, a physical file in her hand, realizing the irony of her sanctuary. She had fled a man who wanted to kill her for what she knew, only to land in the lap of a man whose empire held the very keys to her survival and her destruction. James H. O'Donnell was a man who demanded absolute control, a ruthless SEO who reportedly fired assistants for a single typo. To be his ghost was to walk a razor's edge. If she stayed too quiet, she was invisible. If she saw too much, she was a threat. Katrina leaned against a cold steel shelf, vowing once more to remain a shadow. She would be the perfect mute clerk. She would be the stillness that no one noticed, even as she realized that she was standing at the heart of the only power capable of shielding her from the wolves. The stillness of the sub-basement archives was not merely a lack of sound. It was a vantage point. From the shadows of the 400-level stacks, Katrina watched the world through the digital and physical debris the upper floors cast down. She was the ghost who processed the discarded memos, the shredded drafts, and the internal mail that no one thought twice about. It was here, in the cold, fluorescent-lit silence, that she began to study James H. O'Donnell. He appeared in the archives only once every few weeks, usually late at night when the rest of the tower was a hollow shell of glass. He was a man of jagged edges and a presence that felt like a low-voltage current. The rumors called him the Iron King, a CEO who had clawed his way to the top by being more calculating than his rivals and more ruthless than his enemies. But Katrina, watching him from behind the high-density shelving, saw something the boardrooms missed. She saw a man operating in a state of high-alert isolation. He checked his own security logs. He manually verified files that should have been entrusted to his lieutenants. He was a man who knew he was being hunted. The realization hit her on a Tuesday evening as she was cross-referencing a series of internal procurement orders for the executive suite. Her eyes, trained by a decade of forensic logic, froze on a string of vendor names. They were ghost companies, hollow shells with routing numbers that led back to a private equity firm she had investigated during her final days at Mosley. The architecture of the theft was unmistakable. It was the same signature, the same invisible bleed that had drained her father's company until it collapsed into a heap of scandals and suicides. She sat on her small metal stool, the paper cold beneath her fingertips. Thomas K. Mosley's reach was longer than she had feared. He wasn't just satisfied with destroying her family. He was actively boring into the foundations of O'Donnell Holdings, using the same cleaners and the same financial sabotage. James H. O'Donnell wasn't just a ruthless competitor. He was the next target on the list. A heavy thud echoed through the archive room, followed by the sharp click of the elevator doors. Katrina instinctively retreated deeper into the stacks, pulling her oversized cardigan tight. James entered the room, his tie loosened and his eyes dark with a weary, predatory focus. He walked to the central terminal, unaware that a ghost was watching his every move. He looked at the very file she had been sorting, his brow furrowing as he scanned the data. He knew something was wrong. He could feel the phantom in his accounts. But he didn't have the forensic eyes to see the pattern. Katrina watched him from the darkness, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could speak. She could step out from the shelves, break her 6-month vow of silence, and show him the poison spreading through his ledger. She could give him the names of the men who were currently smiling in his boardroom while sharpening their knives. But to speak was to reveal that Katrina J. O'Connor was alive. It would be a flare in the night, a signal to Mosley that the witness he had killed on the Blackwood Bridge was now arming his greatest rival. She remained a statue in the gray light, watching the most powerful man in the city struggle to find a leak she could plug with a single sentence. The irony was a bitter, metallic taste. James H. O'Donnell was being sabotaged by the same wolves who had eaten her life, and her only way to stay safe was to let them eat his too. She vowed to remain a ghost, even as she realized that the ruthless king was the only man standing between her and the abyss. The atmosphere within O'Donnell Holdings shifted overnight from a clinical hum to a sharp, electric tension. A company-wide security audit had been triggered, a digital and physical dragnet designed to flush out the phantom in the accounts. For the high-level executives on the upper floors, it was a nuisance of interviews and background checks, but in the sub-basement archives, it felt like the closing of a trap. Teams of auditors in crisp suits descended into the silence, their eyes scanning lanyards and their fingers tapping restlessly on tablets. Katrina moved through the stacks with her head bowed, her oversized glasses sliding down the bridge of her nose, projecting a mass of dull, terrified incompetence. The audit was a meat grinder for the temporary staff. Dozens were dismissed for minor discrepancies in their resumes or for a lack of focus under pressure. But Katrina was a ghost who left no friction. Every file she processed was perfectly cross-referenced. Every box she tagged was placed with mathematical precision. She was so efficient she was almost part of the machinery, a variable so constant that the auditors began to overlook her entirely. She was a mute girl, the one who didn't even flinch when the security teams barked orders or slammed heavy ledger books onto her desk. James H. O'Donnell, however, was not the auditors. He arrived in the archives at 3 a.m, bypassing his security detail to walk the rows himself. He didn't want to sanitize reports. He wanted to see the people who handled his history. Katrina was at her station, illuminated by a single harsh desk lamp, her fingers flying over a stack of physical manifests. She felt the sudden drop in temperature that always accompanied his presence, the heavy, magnetic weight of a man who owned the air he breathed. He didn't speak. He stood at the end of the aisle, watching her. He watched the way she didn't look up, the way her hands moved with a strange muscle memory grace that didn't match her drab clothing or her lowly title. Most of the archival staff were sloppy, treating the papers like garbage. This girl handled them like evidence. James stepped into the circle of light, his shadow stretching long and jagged across her desk. Katrina kept her eyes fixed on a line of figures, her heart a frantic bird against her ribs, but her hands never once faltered. The auditors say you've processed more data in 48 hours than the rest of the night shift combined, James said. His voice was a low, resonant blade, cutting through the hum of the ventilation system. They also say you haven't uttered a single word since you were hired. No complaints about the overtime. No request for a break. Just silence. Katrina reached the next file, her movements slow and deliberate. She gave a small, timid nod, her gaze anchored to the floorboards. She was playing the role of the broken, simple clerk, the woman who was too small to be a threat. James leaned down, placing a large, tanned hand on the edge of her desk. He was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. He didn't see a simpleton. He saw performance. His eyes, sharp as a high-frequency scanner, tracked the fine line of her jaw and the way she held her breath. In my experience, people are silent for 2 reasons, he whispered, his eyes narrowing. Either they have nothing to say, or they have a secret so heavy it's crushed their voice. He picked up the manifest she had just completed. His brow furrowed as he saw a small, handwritten correction she had made in the margin, a subtle adjustment to a routing number that reconciled a 3-year-old error no one else had caught. It was a forensic flourish, a deadly display of competence she hadn't been able to suppress. James looked from the paper back to the girl in the gray cardigan. For the first time, he didn't see the furniture. He saw the shattered stillness of a woman who was far too smart to be hiding in the basement. "You're a ghost, aren't you?" he murmured, a flicker of something that wasn't quite ruthlessness, but rather a dark, predatory curiosity lighting his gaze. "I think it's time we moved you to a floor where I can keep a closer eye on my ghosts." The 90th floor was a vacuum of power, a world of glass and silence that made the sub-basement feel like a fever dream. When the private elevator doors hissed open, Katrina felt a sudden, sharp drop in atmospheric pressure. This was the summit, where the air was thinner and every secret carried the weight of a death sentence. She was led past desks of mahogany and steel to the double doors of the inner sanctum. Her gray cardigan felt like a shroud against the sleek, expensive perfection of the executive suite. James H. O'Donnell sat behind a desk of obsidian, his silhouette framed by the sprawling, rain-streaked skyline of the city. He didn't look up when she entered. He let her stand in the center of the vast, silk-carpeted room, the silence stretching until it became a physical pressure against her eardrums. He was reading the manifest she had corrected, the one with a forensic flourish that should have remained buried in the archives. "Sit," he commanded. The word was low, resonant, and left no room for the hesitation she was supposed to feel. Katrina moved to the chair, her movement stiff and awkward, playing the part of the timid clerk. She kept her head ducked, her hair a curtain to hide the panic rising in her throat. She gripped her hands in her lap, her knuckles white, waiting for the dismissal, the rejection, or the accusation. "You can stop the trembling, Katrina," James said, finally looking up. He didn't use her employee number. He didn't use the name on her fake ID. He used a tone that suggested he was looking right through the cheap plastic of her glasses and into the marrow of her bones. The simple girl act was effective for the archives. It fooled the mid-level managers who only look for flaws. But up here, we look for anomalies. And you are the most glaring anomaly I have ever encountered. He stood and walked around the desk, his movements possessing the predatory grace of a man who had never lost a hunt. He stopped just inches from her, forcing her to look up. Katrina met his gaze, intending a project vacancy, but James was too fast. He reached out, his thumb and forefinger tilting her chin upward with a firm, inescapable grip. He didn't see the mask. He saw the shattered stillness in her eyes, the look of a person who watched their world burn and had decided to live in the ashes. He saw the ghost of an education, the flicker of a high-velocity intellect that was currently calculating 5 different ways to escape the room. The girl in the archives wouldn't have known that routing number was a shell company diversion, he whispered, his eyes narrowing. She would have known how to reconcile a 3-year-old bleed in the O'Donnell accounts with a single handwritten note. "You aren't a clerk, and you aren't damaged in the way the agency thinks. You're hiding." Katrina gave a small, desperate shake of her head, her breath hitching. She tried to pull away, to retreat into the safety of her mute persona, but his hold was a velvet vice. "Don't," he warned, his voice a dark, velvet command. "I don't care about your silence, and I don't care about your past yet. What I care about is that you saw a leak that my entire security team missed. You have a deadly eye for the truth, and in this building that makes you a weapon." He let go of her chin, but his gaze remained locked on hers. "I'm moving you to my personal floor. You will be my shadow. You'll be my ghost. And the moment you decide to find your voice, I expect it to be used for me." The transition from the sub-basement to the executive suite was a promotion that felt like an indictment. To the board of directors, the sudden presence of the mute girl at the Iron King's right hand was a baffling absurdity. During the Monday morning briefing, Katrina stood in the corner of the boardroom, a tray of untouched water carafes in her hands, her eyes fixed on the floorboards as the power players of O'Donnell Holdings whisper behind their hands. She was a simple clerk, the charity case James had plucked from the archives to serve as a glorified shadow. "She's a liability, James," the chief operating officer remarked, his voice dripping with a condescending pity as he gestured toward Katrina. "The girl is clearly traumatized, perhaps even cognitively deficient. She doesn't speak, she barely reacts. If you need a personal assistant, hire a professional, not a broken piece of furniture from the basement." James didn't even look up from his tablet. He leaned back in his chair, his expression a mask of bored ruthlessness. "She is exactly what she looks like. Marcus. Damaged. Docile. Invisible. Unlike the rest of the staff, she doesn't gossip. She doesn't have an agenda. And she doesn't leak. She is a void that fills a space. Leave her be." It was a masterful performance of protection, disguised as dismissal. By labeling her damaged, James had rendered her beneath notice, a non-person to the sharks circling the table. He had given her the ultimate cover, the presumption of incompetence. But the moment the double doors hissed shut and they were alone in his private office, the charade evaporated. James didn't ask her to fetch coffee. He dropped a thick, unredacted file of the Q3 audit onto the obsidian desk and tapped the cover. "There's a shadow in these numbers," he said, his voice dropping to that low, dangerous frequency. "My chief financial officer says it's a rounding error. My auditors say it's a tax lag. I say it's a cancer. Find it." He didn't give her instructions. He didn't explain the software. He simply left the room, locking the door behind him, leaving her with the very thing that had almost cost her life: the truth. Katrina stood over the desk for a long minute, her heart hammering. The silence of the office was different from the silence of the archives. It was expectant, heavy with the gravity of a test. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she opened the file. Within seconds, the simple mask fell away. Her eyes began to move with a predatory, high-velocity focus, scanning the columns of data for the familiar rot she had seen in the Mosley ledgers. She didn't use a calculator. She used a forensic map in her mind. She began to see the patterns, the subtle, rhythmic siphoning of capital through a series of offshore holding companies that shouldn't exist. It was brilliant, surgical work, designed to look like legitimate losses. But to Katrina, it was as loud as a scream. When James returned 2 hours later, he found her sitting perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her expression once again blank and vacant. Beside the file lay a single slip of yellow paper. On it, she had written a series of 5 account numbers and a date. No explanation, no words, just the coordinates of the theft. James picked up the paper, his eyes widening as he realized she had found in 2 hours what his entire department hadn't found in a year. He looked at the damaged girl in the gray cardigan, and for the first time, a look of genuine, terrifying respect crossed his face. He realized then that he didn't just have a clerk. He had a weapon of absolute precision. And as he tucked the paper into his breast pocket, Katrina realized that while the board thought she was his charity case, she had actually become his most deadly secret. The transition was swift and absolute, a vertical relocation that felt less like a promotion and more like a tactical deployment. Katrina's new desk was not a desk at all, but a minimalist workstation of brushed steel and tempered glass, positioned directly outside the heavy, soundproof doors of James's private sanctuary. The executive suite was a cathedral of light and ego, a place where the air always felt pressurized, as if the ambitions of the men within were constantly threatening to shatter the floor-to-ceiling windows. From her new perch, Katrina could see the entire city, the same city where she was officially dead, sprawling out like a circuit board beneath her. James had stripped away her anonymity with the clinical efficiency of a surgeon. She was no longer permitted to hide in the sub-basement's damp shadows. She was now the gatekeeper to the Iron King, a role that forced her into the searing light of the corporate elite. But the luxury was a thin veil. The plush carpets, the designer lighting, and the top-tier technology were merely the bars of a very expensive cage. Every movement she made was tracked by high-definition security feeds. Every file she touched was logged by the biometric scanners built into her glass desk. James watched her with an intensity that was almost physical. Even through the glass walls of his office, she could feel his gaze anchored to the back of her neck. He didn't just want her silence. He wanted her proximity. He treated her like a rare, volatile substance that required constant monitoring. When he emerged from meetings, he would pause by her desk, his shadow falling over her like a dark wing, checking the progress of the administrative tasks he had assigned her, tasks that were actually high-level forensic dissections disguised as inventory logs. The isolation was different here. In the archives, she had been ignored because she was perceived as nothing. Here, she was watched because she was perceived as a secret. The executives who passed her desk gave her wide berths, their eyes filled with a mixture of suspicion and a strange, unsettled fear. They saw the mute girl as James's pet project, a broken thing he kept around for reasons they couldn't fathom, and that made her dangerous. Late at night, when the rest of the floor was dark and only the city's neon glow illuminated the glass, The cage felt the smallest. James would leave his office door open, the amber light from his desk spilling across her workstation. He would watch her work in the silence, the two of them alone at the top of the world. He never asked her to speak, and she never offered a sound, but the air between them hummed with the shared knowledge of the poison she was uncovering. She realized then that James wasn't just protecting her from the world. He was possessing her secret. He had turned her into his private oracle, a ghost bound to his service by the very trauma that had silenced her. She was safe from Mosley here, shielded by O'Donnell's formidable power, but she was also his prisoner. As she stared out at the dark horizon, Katrina realized that the gilded office was a mirror of her father's library, a place of high intellect and higher stakes, where the price of protection was a surrender of her own agency. She was no longer running, but she was far from free. The end of the war began not with a shout, but with a flicker on a monitor. Katrina sat at her glass desk, the midnight skyline of the city bleeding into the room through the panoramic windows. Before her lay the final piece of the forensic puzzle, a direct digital link between the sabotage at O'Donnell Holdings and the offshore accounts Thomas K. Mosley had used to bury her father's legacy. The trap was fully mapped, the evidence cold and irrefutable. But as she stared at the glowing cursor, she realized the magnitude of her position. To deliver this killing blow, she couldn't remain a ghost. She would have to become a witness again. James emerged from his office, his coat discarded and his sleeves rolled up, looking less like a CEO and more like a soldier weary from a long siege. He stopped at her desk, his presence a heavy, grounding force in the pressurized silence of the 90th floor. He looked at the screen, then at her, his sharp eyes reading the tension in her rigid posture. He didn't need to see the numbers to know she had found it. He had spent weeks watching her dismantle an empire in absolute silence, and now he stood waiting for the final move. "He's coming for the board meeting tomorrow, Katrina," James said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration in the quiet room. "Mosley thinks he's here to finalize a merger that will swallow this company whole. He thinks the only person who can stop him is at the bottom of the river." He leaned over the desk, his hands bracing against the glass, surrounding her space. "I can block him. I can fight him in the courts for years. But if you want him gone, if you want your life back, you have to give me the voice to go with these files." Katrina looked up at him, her heart a frantic, bruising weight in her chest. For 6 months, her silence had been her sanctuary, a thick, gray veil between her and the monsters. To speak was to break the seal, to let the world back in, and to admit that Katrina J. O'Connor was still vulnerable to the fire. She looked at James, the man the world called Ruthless, the man who had caged her in this gilded office. She saw the predatory focus in his eyes, but she also saw a strange, dark integrity. He wasn't asking her to serve him anymore. He was offering to be the shield while she swung the sword. The silence in the room stretched, agonizing and thick. Katrina felt the words trapped in her throat, a physical obstruction made of trauma and cold metallic fear. She thought of the bridge, the crash, and the way Thomas had sneered at her intellect. She realized then that James was a miracle she had never expected. A man powerful enough to house her truth and dangerous enough to protect it. Her silence had saved her life, but it was her voice that would reclaim it. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they touched the cold steel of the intercom on her desk. She looked James in the eye, the simple, mask-shattering forever, replaced by the lethal brilliance of a woman who had seen the bottom of the abyss and refused to stay there. Her throat burned, her vocal cords raw from months of disuse. She opened her mouth, the air catching for a terrifying second before she forced it through. "He uses the third-tier routing," she whispered. The sound was small, cracked, and fragile, but in the vast, empty executive suite, it sounded like a thunderclap. James didn't move. He didn't smile. He simply nodded, a look of profound, terrifying respect settling over his features. The ghost was gone. The witness was back. And as Katrina stood up, her voice growing stronger with every breath, she knew the ruthless SEO was no longer her captor, but the only man she would ever trust to help her burn Thomas K. Mosley's world to the ground. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It is crazy and more intriguing as you can ever image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.